Welcome to the Jenny Beth Show.
Thank you for being here with the Jenny Beth Show. I'm Jenny Beth Martin. Before we get into today's news, I want to take a moment for something that's been weighing very heavily on my heart today. This weekend, a tragic shooting took place in Shreveport, Louisiana. I'm praying for the family and friends of the victims. I pray they feel God's peace and presence around them so they can feel the peace only He can offer. This was a nightmare domestic violence incident involving a volatile man who apparently had a previous gun violation. I don't know all the ins and outs of that prior arrest, but here's what I do know. If you are a woman in a situation with a violent and dangerous man, please seek help. Almost every county in America has a domestic violence shelter that can help you develop an escape plan. If you cannot find one locally or if you need further help, you can call 800-799-SAFE. That number again is 800-799-SAFE. You are not alone. There are people who want to help you. They just need to know that you need help. Now on to the breaking news. The United States military has seized an Iranian cargo ship in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is threatening retaliation. Iran's foreign ministry says there are no plans for a next round of negotiations. The ceasefire ends this Wednesday, April 22nd, 48 hours from now. Oil and gas prices have spiked over the weekend as the Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of the world's oil supplies. When it closes, the world feels it, as we have been finding out. And meanwhile, Congress is racing against two clocks. One, FISA Section 702 reauthorization and the U.S. surveillance law that allows the government to collect foreign intelligence information from non-U.S. citizens outside of the United States without obtaining warrants, received a 10-day extension. The new deadline is April 20th. House conservatives are fighting to reform Section 702 to include more oversight to help protect Americans' privacy. And second, the Save America Act is now on the Senate floor with a marathon debate. It requires proof of citizenship to register to vote. 87% of Americans support this. That includes 73% of Democrats. Tea Party Patriots Action and Scott Pressler are embarking on a tour of Arizona and Alaska next week to build grassroots pressure on the Senate to pass the Save America Act and to fund DHS fully. We have an outstanding panel today. I am joined by two of the sharpest policy minds in the country. I'm saying the name wrong. Hayden Ludwig is the Director of Policy Research at Restoration of America and the founding editor of the brand new Restoration News Independence magazine. And Steve Milloy is the Senior Policy Fellow at the Energy and Environment Legal Institute and founder of junkscience.com. Hayden and Steve, it's so good to have you with me. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Jenny Beth. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
So we're going to start with FISA and the Save America Act. America's record, we've got a lot to cover. In addition to that, we're going to talk about America's record energy dominance, China's foreign land grab, how Trump is disrupting China's superpower ambitions, and a very disturbing string of deaths among scientists and officials with access to U.S. secrets. So let's get started. Steve, FISA Section 702 just got a 10-day reprieve. The new deadline is April 30th. Walk our viewers what this law actually does and why conservatives are pushing for changes to it.
Well, this section of FISA allows the federal government to basically spy on foreigners, but it also can ensnare some Americans. So conservatives are concerned about that. It's a violation of our privacy rights to be spied on by our government. And, President Trump, for example, is for 702. Many people are. And, of course, we do need to spy, unfortunately. We do need to spy on foreigners, especially those that are planning to do bad things to us. And some of it is going to ensnare Americans. So it's a controversial piece of legislation. I think that I obviously don't have a problem with our government spying on foreigners, but when it ensnares innocent Americans, that's a problem. And there's really no accountability in the legislation for the government when it abuses its powers. But mixed with the SAVE Act, which would require require you to be a U.S. citizen to vote in federal elections, that is a very valuable piece of legislation that we need. And if you can only get saved by passing FISA, well, I think it's a bullet we have to swallow right now. Let's fix our elections, and maybe we can fix FISA later.
Yeah, I think that is a very good point, Steve. And if we can fix our elections, it helps ensure that we've got clean, honest, fair elections going into the fall so that we have a fair playing field and have a chance of winning. Hayden, the Save America Act is on the Senate right now. 87% of Americans support citizenship verification to register to vote, including 73% of Democrats. And restoration, one of the restoration groups launched an ad campaign last week. Where do things stand with Save America from your perspective?
Well, right. Restoration of America, where I work, is the only organization in the country that has a $5 million ad out trying to build grassroots support to push the Save America Act through the U.S. Senate. Currently, you have Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who seems more interested in raising money off the issue going into the midterms than actually delivering results. Now, he's pointing to the obvious fact that he doesn't have the 60-seat supermajority in the Senate needed to overcome any filibuster from the Democrats. But remember, that's a threat of filibuster from the Democrats. Now, he doesn't need to go so far as nuking the filibuster. I think considering the fact that we won't always have the Senate is reason enough to be cautious about that. We can play a little more hardball with the left right now and basically call them on their bluff. Going back to the bigger point, though, of national security, remember, it's not just about photo ID. It's not just about non-citizen voting, which we know is a fact going back many decades. It's also the fact that the Save America Act would require states to share their voter rolls with the Department of Homeland Security. Most people don't realize, but when you move out of state, in most states, especially Democrat-run states, you don't get automatically scrubbed from the voter rolls, right? You actually have to request that get done. And Democrat states are notorious for having spotty voter rolls where people who no longer live there or have died are still registered to vote. Republican states under the Obama administration, like Ohio, did a really good job at cleaning their voter rolls, only to get sued by the Eric Holder-led Justice Department in, I think, about 2013. So it shows you that we are in need of a national reform for some federal standards when it comes to ensuring foreigners aren't meddling in our elections.
You are exactly right. And, something really interesting that I think people don't know that you were bringing up about when you move, it doesn't clean you from voter rolls. Even in red seats, oftentimes you don't get completely removed from voter rolls when you move. And I think that this is shocking to most people because the majority of Americans register to vote when they get their driver's license. So they walk into the DMV, they get their new driver's license, they walk out in the old one, either from the old location where they used to live at within the same state, or if they cross state lines in the new state, they have a completely different state issuing it. The old license is no longer valid and they can no longer use the old license, yet and so that's taken care of automatically. And that same exact office, they register to vote. And what does not happen automatically is that the voter rolls, they don't get cleaned up automatically. So I think most people think, oh, I went into the DMV, I updated my driver's license, I told them to register me to vote. I did not have to say, cancel my old license. So they don't think they need to cancel their old voter registration. And yet, almost everywhere in the country, they do explicitly have to work to get that done. So it's good to be able to clean that up. And what we're finding from those rolls that have been bumped up against the DHS database is that there are over 300,000 people right now on the voter rolls who are deceased as well. So we just need these rolls cleaned up.
Yeah, what you're talking about is called motor voter, and it goes back to 1993. Happens to be the year I was born, which shows you that's the last time the federal government weighed in on a national reform. Think about how technology has advanced in the last 33 years, especially with problems like non-citizen voting. Right now, in 3 states, Vermont, Maryland, and California, plus Washington, D.C., which Democrats pledge they're going to make a state if they take back the Senate, it's legal for cities to allow non-citizens to vote, and many cities have. Obviously, this is a huge problem because you have people supposedly voting only in, municipal and state elections. But what stops them from actually registering to vote in federal elections? And you couple this with the fact that in many states right now, including Virginia, where I live, you can actually register to vote and cast a ballot on election day. That gives absolutely no time for officials to verify that you're not, that you are a U.S. citizen, that you're not lying about your name and address. This is a huge problem. So again, it's really important that we pass this through. I think photo ID is the minimum of what we need here, but it just shows you the entrenched powers that be in Washington, in the establishment class, and of course the woke left, are absolutely dead set on any kind of transparency and accountability in our elections. That's a huge problem right now.
It really is. And I'm so glad Restoration is doing these ads. And as I said a few minutes ago, Scott Pressler and I are going to be in Arizona this weekend. I'll be talking about that more in a little while. But if anyone wants to take action right now, before I get to the closing call to action, you can go to passthesaveamericaact.com. Again, passthesaveamericaact.com. Now, moving on to our next subject, Steve, U.S. oil production just hit an all-time record, 13.6 million barrels a day. America now produces more oil than Saudi Arabia and Russia combined. Put that in terms so that our viewers can feel it in their wallet. What does it mean for what does American energy independence and dominance mean for the family looking to fill up their gas tank today?
Well, before the Iran war, what energy dominance meant was that essentially the U.S. controlled the price of oil in the world because we produced so much oil, and then President Trump had basically seized Venezuela's oil reserves. So we control the most oil, and we're in charge of the marginal price of oil, which determines what the price actually is. Now that we've invaded Iran and the Strait of Hormuz is bottled up, which conducts 20% of the global oil supply, the supply is squeezed. President Trump is hoping that increased U.S. production, plus the closure, will send more ships to the United States, but the world is still short of oil. We are behind in oil production domestically. Even though we're producing more oil than we ever have before, we're still behind domestically because of the 8 years of Obama and 4 years of Joe Biden, where we had the global warming agenda, which inhibited oil production. So, unfortunately, in the United States, we are now feeling higher gas prices. We only produce about 2/3 of the oil that we consume every day. So we still have to import oil. We're still subject to the global price of oil, but President Trump's, assuming that he's going to be successful in Iran, once that situation is taken care of, we are going to be really large and in charge of the global price of oil because we will have control over what Iran is doing, control over Venezuela's reserves, and ours, which are huge. So, the future is great for gas prices and energy prices generally, but we got to get there.
So when you were just saying that we have to catch up from the Biden administration years, elaborate on that just a little bit more, please.
Well, so when Joe Biden became president on the first day, he announced his climate agenda, and he scared off investors in the oil industry. This was at a time when a lot of people were still unsure about the future of wind and solar and how much they would be able to supplant, oil and gas, what oil and gas provides us. So investors were scared off. And the Biden administration, aggressively pushed its global warming agenda. We produced less oil. It wasn't until, Bidenflation forced gas prices to $5, $6, $7 a gallon around the country that he sort of, unleashed the oil industry, if you will, to get to record production. We hit record oil production under Joe Biden because he needed it to reduce inflation and reduce gas prices. And Trump has just picked it up since there. But it was his initial, obeisance to the climate agenda that put us in a big hole.
Okay, that is useful information. And then how long do you think it's going to take us to get out of this big hole? And does that largely depend on Iran, or do you want to set aside Iran and just talk about how things were going before we were looking at the situation with Iran?
Well, I think we ought to be, the United States ought to be working towards where we can provide 100% of our needs and then some for export to the world. I don't know how long the Iran thing is going to take. It's, maybe it'll be settled this week. Maybe it'll go on for months. I just don't know. The world needs that 20% of the oil. It'll take us a while to ramp up our capabilities. So it behooves President Trump to get the situation solved. I don't think we should be negotiating too much longer with the Iranians. We have to get this thing fixed. We need to open the straits, open up Iranian oil production, and lower the price of oil.
And Hayden, you just heard Steve talking about how the Biden administration basically weaponized oil for 4 years, blocking permits, killing pipelines, strangling liquefied natural gas exports. And as Steve was mentioning, Trump reversed all of this. From a policy standpoint, how durable do you think this reversal is? Can the next Democrat administration undo it just as fast? And how do you think this plays into the midterm elections? It was a loaded question for you there.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we should expect the next Democrat to immediately undo as many of these. I don't know that any of they're all wonderful provisions. I mean, Trump is the most pro-energy president this country may have ever had. And yet, I don't think any of those provisions are permanent, at least the biggest ones. That's the huge problem that I foresee. A lot of what President Trump's been doing, obviously, in his foreign policy outlook, does relate to oil. Oil is the new currency, not currency anymore. And I think there's some brilliance to that. In other words, there's a way of fighting China without actually launching missiles their direction. But at the same time, if we let up on that, the Chinese will come roaring back. And part of my concern is what he's doing right now is not going to deal with the Belt and Road Initiative. And we all seem to have forgotten about that. But this is a multi-trillion-dollar initiative over 20 years to basically create independence for China from its oil and its food imports so that it can do everything over land rather than overseas. So as long as that's going on, I think we're going to look at short-term gains here for the ability of the United States to kind of circumvent China's massive dependence on oil. And if a Democrat comes back in 2029, I think we're in a really poor spot, unfortunately. And I hope the president is able to do something to address that, but I'm not sure that he is at this point.
Okay. I hope that he is as well. Steve, do you have any comments on that before I ask you the next question?
Well, I would just say that, the other really valuable goal here, besides denuclearizing terrorists and stopping their missile production and support of global terrorism, is this end round around China. I mean, China right now could shut our economy down tomorrow. All it has to do is confiscate, industrial assets and put in place export bans. We would have no antibiotics, no technology hardware, no rare earths. It would just be a disaster. President Trump is the first president in my lifetime to actually gain ground on China. Now that we control Iranian oil, certainly if nothing else, because the Strait of Hormuz is blocked off, and then we control Venezuela's production. China is an oil poor nation, and China desperately needs Iranian and Venezuelan oil. So President Trump's actions have given us a key leg up on China that will offset, the sort of control over our economy right now. While we decouple from China, oil is a powerful weapon.
And we really do need to decouple from China. We're going to talk a little bit more about China in just a minute. Before we hop over to China, Steve, there have been 167 crude tankers that have declared U.S. destinations, and the Trump administration approved 6,000 drilling permits in a year. That's a 55% increase. Why do these permits matter? What do they do exactly, and why is it so important?
Well, the permits make it possible to produce the oil we need. I mean, we need oil not only for ourselves, but now apparently for the world as well. I mean, we've got to calm down global fears about the Strait of Hormuz shutdown. But even once that problem is solved, we still want to be completely oil independent ourselves. So we need to issue these permits. We need to get the drilling going. We need to have the battles with the environmentalists now. If you want to be the lone global superpower, you pretty much got to be self-reliant, self-sufficient, especially energy-wise. And we're not there yet, but President Trump is moving us in that direction.
Okay, and one last question for you about this energy, Steve, because this is your area. You're so good with the environment and energy. The left says record fossil fuel production is cooking the planet. How do you respond to that?
Well, the whole climate thing is a hoax. I was just at a conference last week where I listened to the 2022 Nobel Prize winner in physics go off for an hour and a half about how fraudulent climate alarm has been. And his basic point was the effect the data that they're using to identify the small global warming effect is an order of magnitude imprecise. So there's no way they could be actually seeing what they're claiming. And so it's been really good that since President Trump came in, he thinks climate is a hoax as well. Now we have President Trump and the Nobel Prize winner, recent Nobel Prize winner in physics, agreeing. So the whole scare is going away.
Good. We need it to go away because we just talked about just a minute ago how when Biden was acting on that hoax, he harmed the United States economy. And we're still digging out from the hole because of the things that he did on day one affecting the climate. And we need people to understand that the things that have been used to scare us were really tactics used to manipulate and control our behavior.
No, that's absolutely right. And, it's not only been a problem in the United States, it's also a problem in the rest of the world. I mean, Europe has shut down its own fossil fuel energy production because of the climate scare. So this Iran problem is worse in places like Europe and India because they believed in it. They fell for it. They shut down their energy production.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm so thankful that we have President Trump in office and he is focused on drilling, baby, drill. Okay, now let's jump back over to China. Hayden, you had a recent article in Restoration News that documents something most Americans have no idea about. Foreign entities now own 45 million acres of United States farmland. That is triple the 1990 level. China controls 277,000 acres across 29 states and Puerto Rico, near more than 340 U.S. military bases and National Guard armories, nearly 20 times more than the media has reported. How do we get here? How is it even legal?
That is a great question. I ask myself that every minute writing that article. Your viewers will remember a few years ago, there was a story that broke in the New York Post about 19 U.S. military bases here in the homeland that are in proximity to Chinese-owned farmland. So I read that and I thought, I bet it's higher than that. And sure enough, it's about 20 times higher than that. There are 342 U.S. military bases that are within 50 miles of Chinese-owned farmland. This is all over the United States country, and it's next to bases like Fort Meade, Fort Detrick, where we do bioweapons research, bases that control our nuclear ICBM stockpile, bases that will be crucial in any war with communist China. Now, you ask yourself how this happened. Well, before just 4 or 5 years ago, actually when that story originally broke, just one state in the United States actually had a restriction on foreign ownership of farmland or forest land, just one state. And that was an old historic law that had nothing to do with modern geopolitics. Since then, almost half the states have passed bans, and all of them, you won't be surprised, are Republican run, like Texas and Florida. But that's also the states with the most U.S. farmland owned by foreigners. Now, 45 million acres owned by foreigners, that's a huge amount. Fortunately, most of that's Canadian or German, and it's owned by companies that have big, pensions that are invested in there. Probably not great, but probably not a dire national security threat. As for China, well, we looked into who those owners are. So China now owns the largest pork-producing company in the United States here in Virginia. It's a 100-year-old company called Smithfield Foods. Why does that matter? It matters because China is both the world's largest producer of food and importer of food. Because of communist technology and inadequacy, they basically cannot farm their own country because of all of the heavy metal pollutions and stuff in their water and ground. So they have to bring in food, and Chinese love their pork. Seriously. So they bring in all of this food to the United States. Now that matters if you know your history. If you go all the way back to World War I, Germany had the similar predicament of having to import all its food. When it went to war with the other powers, it immediately got cut off by the British Navy, and Germans starved to death. The Chinese are very aware of this, and they're very afraid that the same thing will happen. I brought up the Belt and Road Initiative earlier. It's not just about bringing in their own oil. It's also about bringing in all of their food and other essentials into their country so that they can overtake us as a global superpower that doesn't need to rely on imports from any other country. And they've been doing this for years. There's actually a plan that this ties into called the Made in China 2025 strategy, passed under Xi Jinping, where they intend to basically become import and blockade proof. So when you dig into this, you realize the country has no national law that prohibits foreigners from buying this farmland, and they've bought it in strategic places. For instance, you could some of these bases, you can actually build a corn silo and put a little camera on the top and watch planes taking off from the nearby military base. You know, you'd think we'd actually care about these things. Now, there is a Senate bill that would prevent this, but unfortunately, the Republican Senate and its infinite wisdom has yet to bring this bill to a vote, which tells me that they're not going to deal with the problem sufficiently as they should. And frankly, I can't think of a worse thing than selling the inheritance that we're supposed to give our kids to our mortal enemies.
No, I think that you're exactly right about that. So let me ask you this follow-up question. When there's so much land that is near military bases, Hayden, what does it mean for the threats? What kind of threats are there because it's so close to the military bases? You just described that you could be able to see the base from it, but what other threats do we need to be concerned about? And especially in this age where drones are being used so much in military operations now.
Yeah, the drones are a really good point. I mean, let's not forget all of the millions of illegal aliens who came in under Joe Biden. Many of them were Chinese, and certainly they have a PLA connection because nobody leaves the Communist Party of the People's Country of China, People's Republic of China, without the leave of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. I think that's a natural staging ground for them if a war went hot. But let's also remember, too, there's other ways to bring down the country. We're involved right now in chemical warfare with the Chinese. We know that because President Trump last year reclassified fentanyl, which basically exists in the United States because of the Chinese, as a weapon of mass destruction. One of the things I looked into is there's 200,000 acres of forest land in central and rural Oregon that's owned by a Chinese billionaire. Now, those happen to be the same counties where you have a massive growth in Chinese marijuana greenhouse grows. These are all black market in a state that has legalized marijuana, by the way. The black market is huge there and increasingly owned by Chinese who've come into the opioid, the synthetic opioid, and the marijuana industries. That is chemical warfare that kills over 100,000 Americans every single year. And the Chinese know this. I think part of the problem is the United States thinks that we're only at war if we're actually shooting at each other. But the Chinese and all communists, really, they don't distinguish between peacetime and wartime the way we do. They've been locked in a war with us since 1949 when they took control of the country. And the other part about this, too, that's really interesting is there's actually a way to turn this against the Chinese. So right now, it's estimated that there may be as many as $4 trillion in cash and hard assets that are owned by Chinese elites connected with the Chinese Communist Party who live in China that's stashed overseas right now. Why? Because that means the CCP can't get a hold of those assets. Now, if you really think about that, what they're saying is they have no confidence in their own country's future. They're actually hedging their bets against the future of the Chinese Communist Party by moving $4 trillion out of their own country into foreign bank accounts. I think actually the buying up of farmland is kind of a way to do that. Now, that's not benign, but it is a way of actually saying your own party elites don't believe in the future of communism in Xi Jinping's government. And I wish our country would be a little more clever in its propaganda war against the Chinese communists and actually point this out to them, because we could have a coup against these guys, a propaganda coup that is, by explaining that your own people are actually in retreat from your own system.
Wow, that's a really good point. And I haven't heard other people mentioning it in that way. I have to think about that now. Steve, China banned foreign ownership of land inside of China in 1949, yet we allow them to buy land next to our nuclear facilities. How is this a coherent policy? Explain this to
Well,
me.
yeah, no, it's not coherent. And the reality is that, well, let me go back. If you've ever seen the movie Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee, he talks about the art of fighting without fighting, and that's what Hayden was explaining. It's China is fighting us without fighting us. They've infiltrated our country. They sent over all the illegals. They have Chinese students here, and President Trump actually wanted to bring in more Chinese students. They can invest in all sorts of companies. They can buy land. They can do this. They can do that. We make Chinese nationals part of our government. I mean, they have completely infiltrated us. God knows what they could do to us anytime they want. On the other side of the coin, we can't do anything in China. As a matter of fact, just last week, China started threatening U.S. companies that are trying to decouple from China. They threaten them with, prosecution and confiscation of assets. And most Americans still don't understand that China is the enemy. China is not our friend. The Chinese Communist government wants to be the lone global superpower by 2049. This is a serious problem. And they support Iran. They support every anti-U.S. group, the whole Belt and Road Initiative that Hayden was talking about. I mean, that is to spread Chinese influence throughout the world. They're trying to isolate us. They're really the enemy. Yet we have, our government, our corporations love China. It's a problem.
It is just a huge problem. China has no respect for basic human rights. They don't have respect for property rights. They don't have respect for individual rights, speech, religion, press, none of it. So it makes sense. They would say nobody can own property here unless it's basically the Chinese government that owns it. And then in America, it makes sense how the problem happened because we have a much different respect for property rights. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be a suicide pact with a foreign adversary. So
that's exactly right. I'm all for free trade, and I'm for as much freedom as possible. But when it becomes a suicide pact with, a nemesis like China that is not going away, their goal is not to get along. Their goal is to be on top.
It's exactly right. Hayden, you were talking about the fentanyl situation with China, and we're just going to show on the screen. This is the press page from the Select Committee, the House Select Committee on China. This is from the previous Congress. It's not from the current Congress, but they have really good information. They've done a huge investigation into fentanyl and how China has allowed fentanyl to come in, not just allowed China to come into America, but deliberately worked to cause fentanyl to come into America. And I just want to highlight this for our viewers. If they've never seen this page, they should go check it out. It's enlightening and alarming at the same time. Hayden, Peter Schweitzer has documented how Chinese birth tourism creates birthright citizens who have a standing to hold property, access systems, and eventually acquire land and vote. We have the birthright citizenship case in the Supreme Court right now. How does that ruling, whichever way it goes, affect what you're seeing with the land ownership by China specifically right now?
Well, unfortunately, it looks like the Supreme Court is leaning against the Trump administration. Nobody but the justices know this, of course, but that's what early readings seem to suggest, which is very unfortunate because, as we know, birthright citizenship is a farce. It's a joke. It's never what the people who actually drafted the 14th Amendment intended. That had to do with giving former Black slaves citizenship in the United States. It had nothing to do with empowering our rivals. But, this goes back to, you mentioned the fentanyl crisis up there a moment ago, and I'm very familiar with that. And it's a great investigation and people should read it. This is actually not a new problem, though. Back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, U.S. military base commanders in Vietnam noticed that their men were coming down with serious illnesses and overdosing problems caused by heroin. And when they investigated, they found that men were buying heroin below market price, basically as being subsidized. And they were able to trace it back to the Chinese government, because the Chinese, Steve points out, they understand that war is not just shooting guns, and you don't have to have a declaration. It's political, it's economic, it's trade, it's spiritual, it's everything. And they're engaged in that front right now. So I'm not surprised that the PLA sends its officers to basically do a birthright tourism run with their wives in the United States. There's also an interesting aspect that goes back to the pro-life community here too. In vitro fertilization, IVF, which is a very controversial issue among many pro-lifers because of the way that the babies are actually born and the number of fetuses that are thrown out. That actually has a role in all of this, because there is a number of individuals in China that basically offer IVF services to these PLA officers to kind of do this kind of birthright citizenship thing at scale. You have to remember, these babies are not raised in the United States. They possess American citizenship. So yes, they could buy more land. Theoretically, they could also vote overseas. The US for decades has had infrastructure designed to let people vote overseas. And that was originally created, of course, for the servicemen and women who are stationed abroad or fighting wars. But it's slowly evolved to take in just about anybody who wants to go and live overseas. It's called UOCAVA, and you'll forgive me if I don't remember what the UOCAVA actually stands for. But it is the way that Americans can vote when they're overseas, even in states they've never lived in. And it's a serious problem that I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese are exploiting right now. So it's great that the states are starting to notice this, and Republican states are passing laws, but Democrat states are never going to pass those laws. Congress needs to take it seriously and recognize, we're not even on the defensive right now. We are allowing ourselves to be infiltrated, as Steve pointed out, and hollowed out from within. And President Trump was elected, 10 years ago, originally on a platform of bring the jobs home. Well, why did the jobs leave? The jobs left because of basically an agreement between our own elites here in NAFTA under the original Bush administration, the Clinton administration, and the Chinese to export jobs from Ohio and Indiana to Beijing and Shanghai. Well, he's elected to get those things back. That was a form of economic warfare. So if we're going to fight back on that front, we got to fight back on all of these fronts.
You are exactly right. And a lot of what you were just talking about is why we need to pass the Save America Act. And we need to get that done. UOCAVA is the Uniform and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act. The Uniform and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. And then when we come back, we're going to tie some of this together and go on to some interesting and good news about climate hoaxes. Welcome back. Let's connect some of the threads we've been pulling all afternoon. Steve, you posted this morning that President Trump is fundamentally disrupting China's plan to become the world's only superpower, and that operations against Venezuela and Iran have completely reset the global oil market. You were kind of alluding to that a few minutes ago. Lay out that argument for our viewers. How do these operations change the international energy order and also completely disrupt China's plans?
Well, China's war against the U.S. has been pretty successful so far, without any fighting. They have infiltrated our society. They have taken our jobs away. We don't even, and appeased us with low-priced goods in return. China only has one flaw in the ointment, really, and it's the fact that it's oil poor. And as big a country as it is, China just does not have very many oil and gas reserves. And to run a modern economy, certainly to be the world's lone global superpower, you need to be energy efficient. China is not. It has a lot of coal. It's starting to develop nuclear, but of course, you cannot invade Taiwan with jets fueled by coal or ships fired by coal. You need oil and gas. So China's plan was moving along, even with President Trump in office, because President Trump hadn't really done that much to China, that much to decouple the U.S. from China. But now, since Venezuela, with Iran, he has taken real concrete steps for the first time, since Nixon opened the door to China, to gain some strategic ground back. China, needs to buy oil from Venezuela, needs to buy oil from Iran now, and since we're going to be controlling that, it's going to be buying the oil from us. So that is going to give us a little bit of a window and a little bit of leverage over China that hopefully continued Republican foreign policy leadership will be able to turn the tide against China and gain us some strategic advantage back. Because right now we're really at China's mercy. I mean, it's the one thing that really frightens me. And China could turn our lights off tomorrow if it wanted. Our energy grid is dependent on China. China has been selling us green technology that I'm quite sure is sabotage. As a matter of fact, some batteries, utility scale batteries that were installed at Camp Lejeune, the Marine base in South Carolina, had to be taken out by Duke Energy because they were found to be sabotaged by China. Solar panels, solar inverters, these things have all been sabotaged by China. Electric vehicles from China. That's why China wants to get electric vehicles into the U.S. It's not really interested in selling us low-price cars. What it's interested in is getting Americans hooked on Chinese technology, which has been sabotaged. And either we'll have kill switches, can be turned off at whatever time, or we'll provide them more information. Everything China does is strategic to benefit China. China is not interested in trade where both sides mutually benefit. They want to gain the advantage.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. When you're talking about the cars and the other things that they can do, they could use those as kill switches. They could take over where they go and basically just completely weaponize any of these items that you're talking about that have energy. And we're naive not to think of it that way, because they, as you both were saying earlier, they think of war and control much differently than we do in the United States. We think of it through our military, and they have a much more asymmetrical approach when it comes to warfare. Hayden, from a national security standpoint, America as the world's undisputed energy leader, does that change the calculation for China and Iran and our adversaries? Do you think that the things that President Trump is doing and the way he's working across the world and here in America are going to disrupt the Chinese influence?
I think they have the possibility of doing that, but as we're learning, these wars are harder to end than they are to start. That's a platitude that everybody says, but it's true. Unfortunately, the president's no fool. He knows he needs to get a deal done with the Iranians that is short of a full ground invasion. I don't think he's going to do that, but Steve mentioned it earlier. Is that months, weeks? We don't know. I think he's working. That's obviously his number one concern right now. One of the things that I think we should be concerned about with the Strait of Hormuz right now is the number of naval assets that has tied up. Now, necessarily so to actually enforce the blockade. But let's remember, we only have so many aircraft carriers, some of which are out of commission or undergoing refit in the Mediterranean and in the homeland right now. And if we ever fight a war with China, it will be an air and naval war. There will be no tanks involved in that kind of fight unless somehow it ended up going on for years on Taiwan proper. And I think China is watching this very closely. They learned some lessons from the Ukraine war about don't get bogged down in a war if you can fight it and win in a matter of weeks. And one of the things that I suspect, knowing how devious the Chinese Communist Party is, they will probably, if they do launch an attack on Taiwan, they probably won't do a Pearl Harbor style attack, meaning launching missiles at Guam and our bases at Okinawa and the Philippines and so on. They'll probably try to avoid antagonizing Japan and our other allies, and they'll probably attempt to avoid attacking U.S. troops directly. Why? Because that gives the United States a way to force the issue with them. And if the Chinese are smart, they'll exploit the unfortunate division in our own country, in our own party too, and try to actually launch that attack slowly, cautiously, so that we come across as the aggressor. Obviously, we wouldn't be. But the Chinese are really clever about that, and they know that we've used a lot of our missiles right now in our Pacific stockpiles to fight the Iranians, and those take many millions of dollars and in some cases years to rebuild those stockpiles. So if I was Beijing, I'd be watching this and saying, look at how easily the Americans risk getting bogged down over a middle power like Iran. What would happen? What would they do if we said, I dare you to come attack my ships when I'm attacking Taiwan? I think that's the worst case scenario for the United States. And there's reason to believe that they're eyeing that right in the near future. When you look at the state of the economy, it's still very much trying to recover from COVID, even from the Biden years even. Inflation is still a problem. And I think the president's got the right idea on these things, but he may not have the time he needs. The Chinese are looking at the divisions even within the conservative movement right now and saying, would the Americans unite around the president if we've challenged them over Taiwan? I don't think anybody knows the answer, and that's the scary thing. Because if it happened 20 years ago, we would have united. Nowadays, I'm not so sure, and that's what makes me nervous. So Trump is very clever in that he's trying to avoid actually a straight-on confrontation with the Chinese military by cutting off their oil, by exposing their weaknesses and their vulnerabilities. And that's why I said earlier, we have to get smart about the propaganda war. The very fact that so many Chinese elites have money stashed in places like Switzerland and the Caymans should be propagandized all over China. Your own elites don't believe in the future of your country. Are you going to die for Xi Jinping on a beach in Taiwan for something that won't make your life any better? Your elites are ready to get out of there if they think things start to turn over in your country. So we need to get really clever at this kind of thing, like we did in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And I think Trump understands that, but I'm not sure the rest of the GOP and certainly the Democrats don't.
I think that when it comes to that kind of propaganda war, I just don't think that America understands how powerful propaganda. I don't think normal American citizens understand how powerful propaganda is. I think that some of what we're seeing online is propaganda from foreign countries, and even some of the clicks and the likes and the reposts that we see online could be happening from foreign countries trying to influence American thought. And it's hard for us to imagine that because we just don't think of war in that same manner. And the voice of America has been largely changed, and there was a lot of corruption in it. It needed that corruption needed to be rooted out. But in order to execute what you're talking about, Hayden, the propaganda aspect of it, you probably have to have a delivery mechanism of some kind, similar to what Voice of America, the purpose of Voice of America had during the Cold War.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, even look at TikTok, right? Do you think that the Chinese would allow us to put a national security protected app in their country that did nothing but propagandize their people in the direction of the United States? Or just put mindless junk out there for their young people to consume? Of course not, because they're smart like that. And the thing is, it's embarrassing because we used to be so clever in the Cold War. We had the moral high ground and we knew it and we used it effectively. I mean, ruthlessly in a moral Christian way. I mean, and now the country, I worry that even the military is fairly compromised when you've got guys like Mark Milley saying, he'll warn the enemy before we're about to do anything. I mean, these are huge problems. So, I mean, really winning the war does actually start at home. And the GOP understands this. The president understands this. I think MAGA overall gets the threat from China. And that's to President Trump's credit. He's the guy who made that happen. But, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they're opposing these tariffs because they think that once Trump's out, it'll be back to business as usual. And business as usual basically means whatever the CCP thinks is best for the CCP. That has to change. And I don't know how you start that, except that we need to get every American to understand the way we did after 1945. This is real communism, and this is a dire threat to everything you hold dear.
Those are very good points, Hayden. And then, Steve, you're the one who posted about it this morning. Do you have anything to follow up on before we jump to our lightning round?
Yeah, we should not take the Chinese for granted. Communists are very clever. They have been, working in the United States since the 1930s. They help the left. I've got information, and it's public. The Chinese have been funding U.S. environmental groups to wreck our economy. There's no question that China either directly or indirectly funds a boatload of influencers on social media. They're everywhere. They're for China, and we really haven't dialed into it yet. And it's hard enough for us to get conservatives to pay attention to this, and Democrats don't really want us to pay attention to it because Democrats, of course, with their left leaning, they want to be in charge of everything. They want to sort of, they think that China is helping them gain control. And I'm not quite sure that's the way it's going to work out. The last thing I want to add is that, as far as Taiwan, China is really snuggling up with the opposition party in Taiwan. And I think, China would like to take Taiwan peaceably if they can. And I think they're going to try to do that politically.
Very alarming, especially considering the microprocessors. I think that I'm using the right word. That they're produced in Taiwan. If China controls it, they could have a bug on every single device and spy on everyone in the world who's using them.
They can they can just deny us the chips.
Yeah.
And then what are we going to do? We can't build an F-35, our most advanced fighter. We can't build an F-35 without communist China. That's just reality.
And it's very alarming. I understand why we reached out to China and tried to drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union decades ago. But now it's time to do what President Trump is doing and rethink what this relationship is and whether it benefits America or not. One last thing before we move on from this, there's a book that's on my reading list. I have not read it yet, but as you were talking about this, Hayden, it made me think about it. It's called America Against America. It's written by a Chinese man, and I haven't read it, so I can't say everything about it, but when you were talking, Hayden, I was like, I've got to go read that book because it's what I think China may be trying to do with us, turn Americans against America and against one another and divide us from within without even having to fire a shot.
Yeah, I think reading books like that is wonderful, and it's also terrible for your blood pressure. Ask me how I know.
Yeah, exactly. I've read a few about China, and boy, it's alarming. Okay, let's change subjects and move to this. Steve, 11 scientists and officials with access to U.S. secrets have died or gone missing. Fox News has been reporting on it. Do you think this is a normal news, not just normal news environment, but do you think that all of these are interconnected? It certainly sounds quite alarming to me.
I don't know. I've been watching these news reports all week, and it's really hard to say. I mean, it could just be a giant coincidence. It could be something going on. There's the one woman talking about anti-gravity. She's working on anti-gravity, and that was the beginning of the end of her life. The anti-gravity thing just doesn't rub true to me. So I don't know. It's really a weird story. Will anyone ever get to the bottom of it? The government investigating the government? I don't know. It's a weird story.
Okay, and Hayden, what do you think? You write for Restoration News. What do you think about this? And how should the media be approaching it? I first heard about problems with scientists being killed back when the MIT and Brown shooting happened, and there was a scientist involved in that. And now we've had more since then. But like Steve, I don't know whether it's a coincidence or they're interconnected.
Well, it seems somebody in government thinks they're interconnected. And that tells me a lot. I have no idea, of course. How could we? But I think we got to take those kind of things seriously. I mean, these are really senior, important people. And even if they're working on dead-end technology that may not go anywhere, and I don't know, I'm not a tech guy, even if that's the case, that's the kind of stuff that the War Department pays very close attention to. I think there's a big problem with infiltration and defection in there. And let's remember too, I know we keep bringing up China, but it's the number one problem here, just like the Soviet Union was. There's a lot of theft that goes on here. So I think the fact that the media, which remember, oftentimes the mainstream media gets its talking points from Langley, we all know that. Let's remember that there's a huge problem with Chinese coming in and stealing our intellectual properties. The FBI estimates that it's between $600 and $800 billion each year in intellectual property theft, almost $1 trillion. So people are dying to boot. I think that's something that warrants investigation. I only wish I knew more facts about the case.
And I guess that time will tell. And it's the first
Maybe.
time we've talked about it here on the show, but I think it's worth mentioning. It's something to watch. Whether we need to be alarmed about it or not, I think time will tell. Okay, very quickly, 3 last very quick topics for you. First, we're going to start with Hayden. Restoration News launched a new magazine called Independence Magazine. Tell us, what is the mission of it and where can people go to get this?
Yeah, I'd love to. So restoration-news.com is our website. It's also where you can subscribe to our quarterly magazine that we just launched earlier this year. So if you don't know us, Restoration News is about 3 years old, and we do investigative journalism, commentaries, and deep dive research for the America First movement. So we are not a mainstream organization. We are a populist conservative organization, but we write with facts first. And everything you've heard me talk about is stuff that me and my team of about a dozen researchers and opposition researchers have dug up and posted on our website, restoration-news.com. Now, part of what we want to do is also give the populist MAGA movement a kind of intellectual edge that it might lack right now. So which is why we launched Independence Magazine. Independence, of course, named for America's 250th birthday this coming 4th of July. So in it, you'll find great commentary on everything from the pro-life movement to the kind of stuff that Steve is an expert on when it comes to combating the global warming lies, all the way to how we actually de-woke the U.S. military, which is a huge project that we're currently involved in, and yes, things on communist China and in between. So we're launching our next issue over the summer, and we're aiming for June, and we'd love for people to subscribe. So if you go to restoration-news.com and you go to the very top, you'll see Get Independence Magazine. And you can actually read the first copy for free right now, no strings attached. We're giving it away because we believe in our product. So check it out. Subscribe to our newsletter. We release it every week. We promise not to sell your content, sell your data, or spam you. And it's all about the kind of stuff that you don't see even big conservative sites release. Because frankly, we read between the headlines. That's why we did this big deep dive on CCP ownership of farmland, because we know most journalists are kind of lazy and a little bit dumb, and they go too fast, even when they're well-intended. I know you guys know what I'm talking about. So we take the time to actually go in and find what are the facts, and we always deliver it from a conservative Christian worldview. So when you're getting the real deal with us. So yeah, please check it out, Independence Magazine and restoration-news.com.
Thank you, Hayden. Okay, Steve, when I saw this story, I thought of you because you told me a while back that you thought some of the alarmism about microplastics was a bit overblown. The University of Michigan researchers found that gloves scientists use to study microplastics may be contaminating the cycles, and it means they may be overstating the problem.
Yeah.
What do you know about this?
Well, look, we've been using plastics for more than 100 years, and they're very inert. They've been degrading in the environment. There are bits of plastic everywhere. There's bits of plastic in the air and the food, the water. And while that may sound scary to you, you have to keep in mind they're inert. It means they don't react with the body. It takes a lot to get plastic to react. You have to melt it. And that doesn't happen in the body. When you ingest microplastics, you excrete them. So these researchers found that they were trying to measure microplastics, and what they discovered was the microplastics on their glove were, contaminating their samples, so they were measuring too much microplastics. About a year ago in February, there was a study published, got a lot of media, that we have 2 plastic spoons worth of microplastics in our brain. That microplastics are accumulating in our body. And as it turns out, well, what they were looking at was not really microplastic, it was fat. The brain is 60% fat. And they just got a false positive for microplastics. And so there's all this hysteria. The MAHA movement is getting into microplastics. There's really no science behind this. Microplastics don't accumulate in our bodies. You can measure some in our bodies at any given time just because there's microplastics always traveling through them. But our body gets rid of them. They're everywhere in the environment. But there's no evidence of any harm from microplastics. It's just another one of these, anti-fossil fuel, radical environmentalist scares that just seems to be uncontrollable.
Why do they want to make plastic the bad guy?
Well, plastic is a handle against the fossil fuel industry. Radical environmentalists don't like fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, of course, go in make plastics possible. That's what they're made of.
Got it.
And so, any way that environmentalists can cause problems for the fossil fuel industry, which of course makes us energy dominant, and they don't like that either, they're going to go after it. And since the climate scare is going away, well, they're going to ramp up scares about chemicals, which they're doing, and also microplastics.
Okay. Now, very last topic, a little bit more lighthearted. We'll start with Steve. Polar bears are apparently not going extinct. And I guess that's a convenient truth. In contradiction to what climate alarmists have told us for the last 20 years. What do you think about this, Steve?
Well, of course. So polar bear, global warming. What's your symbol going to be? Well, polar bears, which live in the Arctic. And global warming is, of course, going to make the Arctic ice-free. That's what Al Gore said in 2007. Of course, he was wrong. He said that the Arctic would be ice-free by 2014. It's still got plenty of ice. Polar bears have plenty of ice, and most importantly, there are more polar bears than ever. They were hunted to near extinction in the 1950s and 1960s, but then hunting bans came into place, and since then they've been flourishing. And there's plenty of ice for them. Their population is burgeoning to the point where they actually have to invade human villages in some places for food. So, this has been a complete bust for the environmentalists because there's more polar bears than ever.
And Hayden, how does the question with the polar bear story connect to the broader pattern of leftist misinformation that your organization tracks?
Well, I always thought it was kind of funny that the left chose the polar bear as its environmental mascot, considering that the polar bear actively seeks out to eat human beings, which, of course, global warming does too. So, it's wonderful that we're saving the polar bears and everything. But, what I've noticed is the left, of course, they just emote. They don't actually give you any factual talking points. They certainly wouldn't rebut anything that Steve or I would bring up that's factual. But they talk a lot about the weather. Every bit of weather, whether it's hot or cold outside, is evidence of global warming somehow. Yet they've never been able to tell me what is the actual weather, the nominal weather of the planet. What should it be? What's the temperature outside? What should it be, right? What about carbon dioxide? What is the correct parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere? It's about 400 parts per million. Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but about 400 parts per million right now. The left wants it lower than that. And yet lower than that is, what we saw in the global ice ages thousands and thousands of years ago. When the dinosaurs roamed the earth, it was many times 400 parts per million here. So, and again, I'll just make the point too, if they really were consistent with their beliefs, they'd be blowing up greenhouses instead of Tesla dealerships because we pump those things full of CO2 to grow plants. So I see Greta Thunberg thinking all over this, not, reasonable human being thinking.
It's very true. It's not reasonable at all. There is a fun fact about polar bears. They can have any litter size, but twins are the most common when a mama polar bear gives birth. And I learned this when my twins were young, a little bit around 20 years ago, so maybe about the time the left was trying to turn polar bears into the mascot. But as a mom of twins, I am glad polar bears are not going extinct. And now that my son is a grown adult and is an Eagle Scout, he's told me polar bears are quite frightening and you never actually want to run into one in real life. So they're not as cute as they appeared when the kids were younger. Steve and Hayden, thank you both so much for being on the show today. It was a lot of fun. I hope I can have you on again soon.
Okay, Jenny,
well,
thank you.
Much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. And before we go, 2 calls to action. First, the United States Senate, you need to call them right now and tell them to pass the Save America Act and to fully fund the Department of Homeland Security. The number for the Capitol switchboard is 202-224-3121. Again, 202-224-3121. Please call there twice. Call each of your United States senators today. And the second, well, I guess we've got 3 calls to action. So there's a subset, and that is that Tea Party Patriots Action, Scott Pressler and I are headed to Arizona this Saturday and Sunday, and then to Alaska next weekend. I'd love to see you at our events. Join us. If you are in either of these states, you can get more information by going to teapartypatriots.org to events.teapartypatriots.org. And now for our full second call to action, call the House, especially the sponsors and co-sponsors of the so-called Dignity Act, and tell them to vote that you want no amnesty. And they do not need to be sponsoring this bill because it is amnesty. The same number, 202-224-3121. No amnesty, not now, not ever. Thank you so much for being here with me today. And if you liked hearing from Steve Milloy today, be sure to check my archives for the long interview show I did with Steve a while back. I learned so much from him. You can subscribe to The Jenny Beth Show on YouTube, Rumble, and wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you do that. And thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. If you enjoyed today's conversation, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people who care about liberty and the Constitution. You can find this and other episodes at jennybethshow.com, as well as Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, Instagram, X, and your favorite podcast platform.
The Jenny Beth Show is hosted by Jenny Beth Martin. The Jenny Beth Show is a production of Tea Party Patriots Action. For more information, visit teapartypatriots.org.